The air was thick with summer heat, the kind that clings to your skin and makes the asphalt shimmer like it's alive. The sun hung low but bright, casting long, sharp shadows across the grocery store parking lot. Sophie adjusted the strap of her purse with one hand and balanced a bag of groceries in the other. Her son, Leo, clutched her free hand tightly, his tiny fingers sticky from the popsicle he'd convinced her to buy. The parking lot smelled like hot rubber and engine oil, and the sound of shopping carts rattling against pavement filled the air. Her car, an aging Honda Civic with a cracked taillight, was just a few steps away. Relief passed over her face. It had been a long day, the kind where tips were bad, customers worse, and patience even shorter. All she wanted was to get home, microwave something barely edible, and collapse on the couch beside Leo. As she reached the car door and dug for her keys, a loud screech of tires cut through the moment. Sophie flinched. An SUV, glossy black and far too large for the tight lot, whipped around the corner and slid into the space beside hers, cutting the wheel so sharply that it grazed her grocery cart. A bag toppled over, and a dozen apples rolled onto the pavement. Sophie's mouth dropped open. "Are you serious?" she muttered, pulling Leo back instinctively. The SUV door flung open, and out stepped a woman who looked like she belonged in a reality show about luxury home makeovers. She wore oversized sunglasses that covered half her face, her platinum hair perfectly styled in a high bun. In one hand, she held a designer tote bag. In the other, an iced coffee with her name, Karen, boldly scrawled in Sharpie. She took one. Look at Sophie and the spilled apples. Then sighed dramatically. "You shouldn't leave your cart in the middle of the lot," she said, her voice like honey laced with venom. "Some of us are trying to park like adults." Sophie bent down to retrieve the apples, trying to keep her tone level. "You nearly hit my son." Karen gave Leo a brief glance, then turned her attention to her car window, checking her reflection. "Well, maybe don't let him wander through traffic. It's not my job to babysit." Sophie's jaw tightened. "He wasn't wandering. You came flying around that corner without even looking." Karen rolled her eyes and took a slow sip of her coffee. "Sweetheart, if you're that concerned about safety, maybe you should drive something a little less depressing." She gestured lazily to Sophie's Honda, sneering as if the car personally offended her. Sophie reached for the last apple, her fingers trembling. "I think you owe me an apology." Karen chuckled. "Oh, honey, no, what I owe is nothing to anyone. Who shops here?" She pulled out her phone and, to Sophie's astonishment, began snapping pictures of her license plate. "Just in case something happens to my car. You people are unpredictable." "You people?" Sophie repeated, her voice low. Karen smirked but didn't answer. She sauntered past them, brushing so close that her purse nearly smacked Sophie in the leg. Her perfume, overly floral, artificial, lingered in the air. As she passed Leo, she paused just long enough to glance down and murmur, "Poor kid. Doesn't stand a chance with a mother like that." Leo's face crumpled, and he gripped Sophie's hand tighter. "Hey," Sophie called out, her voice sharper now. Karen didn't turn around. She waved a manicured hand over her shoulder and disappeared into the store. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, heart pounding. Her mind raced with things she could have said, should have said, but none of them made it past her lips. Instead, she knelt beside Leo and picked him up. "It's okay," she whispered, kissing his temple. "She's just mean." "She's a bad guy," Leo said, wiping his nose on her shoulder. Sophie nodded. "Yeah, she kind of is." Later, that night, the incident played over in her head like a film reel stuck on repeat. The way Karen had looked at her, not just with disdain, but with dismissal. As if Sophie barely registered as a human being. As if her existence was an inconvenience. She sat on the couch in her small apartment, her knees tucked under her, an untouched bowl of mac and cheese in front of her. Leo was asleep in the next room, the faint sound of his breathing through the baby monitor offering the only calm. She picked up her phone and called her sister. "She keyed your cart?" Her sister gasped. "What did you do?" "Nothing," Sophie admitted, hating herself for it. "I just stood there." There was a pause. Then softly, "I get it. You have Leo. You don't want to make a scene." Sophie leaned her head back against the couch. "I'm tired, Em. I'm tired of people like her thinking they can do anything, say anything, and get away with it." Another pause. "Well," her sister said slowly, "maybe next time she won't be so lucky." Sophie stared at the ceiling. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe people like Karen would eventually face consequences. But that had never been her experience. People like Karen didn't get punished. They got promotions, followers, applause. She set the phone down and stood up, walking to the window. The city lights blinked back at her, impersonal and cold. In the reflection, she saw herself, hair messy from the day, circles under her eyes, shoulders slumped. She looked like someone who'd already given up. But then she thought of Leo, of the way he'd looked at Karen, afraid, confused, of the way he'd called her a bad guy. Sophie's expression hardened. Maybe she hadn't stood up today. But the game wasn't over yet. She reached over and turned off the lamp. Karen didn't know it yet, but she'd just picked the wrong mother. The diner buzzed with the low hum of conversations and the clatter of cutlery against porcelain plates. Overhead, the fluorescents flickered faintly, casting a pale light over the vinyl booths and checkered floors. Sophie moved through it all, like a shadow, efficient, invisible. Her apron was stained from a lunchtime rush, and her sneakers ached against her heels, but she kept her smile intact. The tips had been meager, but at least the night was halfway over. She refilled a customer's coffee and checked her watch. Just 3 more hours, then she could go home, kiss Leo goodnight, and maybe have 5 minutes of quiet to herself. Table 6, her manager called, nodding toward the entrance. Sophie turned and froze. Karen. She strolled in like she owned the place, phone in one hand, sunglasses still perched atop her head despite the dim lighting. Her designer heels clicked against the linoleum floor. A small entourage followed. 2 women who looked like carbon copies, all glossy smiles and Botoxed brows. Sophie's stomach twisted. She ducked behind the counter, but her manager had already spotted her. "Take it," he said. "They're regulars. Don't screw it up." Of course they were. Sophie wiped her hands on a towel and forced herself to walk toward the table. Karen looked up, and the recognition was immediate. A flicker of amusement passed over her face, like finding a bug she'd thought she'd squashed still crawling around. "Oh, look who it is," she said loudly, sliding into the booth. "Small world." Sophie kept her voice level. "Good evening. Can I start you with drinks?" Karen leaned back in her seat, studying her like a scientist examining a particularly dull specimen. "Funny. I didn't know they let people like you work here." Sophie ignored the jab. "Would you like to hear our specials tonight?" Karen turned to her friends. "I think we're okay without the sales pitch. We already know what we want, right, ladies?" They all nodded in synchronized smugness. As Sophie scribbled down the order, Karen held up her phone, angling it discreetly toward Sophie. "Snap." "You're taking pictures of me now?" Sophie asked, her tone sharp enough to cut. Karen didn't even blink. "Just documenting, in case my food's late or poisoned. You seemed unstable the other day. Wouldn't want to take chances." Sophie opened her mouth to respond, but Karen cut her off. "Tell me," she said, her voice sweet and poisonous. "Do you always overreact when someone doesn't bow to your imaginary authority? Or was that tantrum in the parking lot a special occasion?" Sophie felt heat rise in her cheeks. She looked around. No one was watching. No cavalry was coming. She turned and walked away. Behind her, Karen laughed. The rest of the evening passed in slow-motion agony. Karen made a sport out of it, sending back her salad twice, claiming her water wasn't cold enough, asking to speak to the manager only to tell him Sophie seemed off. Each time, Sophie smiled, apologized, and kept going. When the check came, Karen pulled a penny from her wallet and dropped it onto the table with a delicate flick of her fingers. Beside it, she placed a small white napkin. On it, in looping cursive, "Maybe get a job you're not terrible at." Sophie stood there, the words burning into her skull, the copper coin gleaming like a mockery of every night she'd gone without dinner, so Leo could eat. When they finally left, her manager ambled over and raised an eyebrow. "What did you do to them?" "I did my job," he snorted. "Well, she didn't think so. Said you were unpleasant." Sophie said nothing. There was no point. She cleaned the table slowly. As she wiped away the napkin, the edge of her rag caught the penny and sent it spinning across the floor. She didn't bother picking it up. After her shift, the parking lot was quiet, dimly lit by flickering streetlights. She approached her car, exhausted, and nearly missed the jagged white line etched across the driver's side door. Her breath caught. She stepped closer. The paint was peeled back in a long, malicious gash. Keyed. Deep. A folded slip of paper flapped beneath the windshield wiper. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. "Watch yourself. No signature, but no need for one." Sophie stood there, frozen. The night air wrapped around her like a shroud. Her first instinct was to cry, scream, call the police. But the moment passed, and what replaced it wasn't sadness. It was something colder. She reported. The vandalism anyway. The officer was polite but unhelpful. "You didn't see who did it?" "No." "No security cameras?" "No." "Well, unless you've got a witness, it's going to be hard to prove anything." She thanked him, gave her statement, and drove home in silence. The scratches on her car caught the moonlight, mocking her with every turn. At home, Leo was already asleep, sprawled across the bed like a starfish. She sat beside him, brushing the curls off his forehead. "You're a superhero, Mommy," he'd told her once, handing her a crayon drawing with a cape and big red boots. She stared at that drawing now, taped to the fridge. The cape flared behind the stick figure mom as she stood tall beside a smiling boy. Sophie wasn't wearing a cape tonight, but she felt something stirring inside her anyway. Not rage, not revenge, resolve. Because Karen wasn't just a rude customer or a bad tipper. She was someone who wielded power without consequence. Someone who laughed while stepping on people like Sophie and never looked down long enough to see the damage. But damage had a way of growing roots. Sophie stood in the kitchen, bathed in the glow of the refrigerator light, and stared at her reflection in the window. She saw the weariness there, the dull ache of too many long nights and too few victories. But behind that, just beneath the surface, something sharper was taking shape. Karen had gone too far this time, and Sophie was done playing. Nice. It started with a simple Google search. Sophie sat cross-legged on her couch, the blue glow of the laptop screen washing over her tired face. Leo was at daycare, the apartment was finally quiet, and the gash across her car door still lingered. In her mind, like an open wound. She typed Karen Midtown SUV social media into the search bar, almost expecting nothing to come up. But within seconds, there she was. Karen Whitmore, local lifestyle influencer, entrepreneur, and self-proclaimed luxury guru. Her Instagram was a curated shrine to excess, glistening countertops, overpriced candles, gym selfies, and passive-aggressive. Captions pretending to be motivational. "Don't be jealous of my blessings. Work for yours." Beneath each photo were hundreds of likes, compliments from sycophants, and comments like "Queen" and "Slay all day." Sophie clicked through the highlights. One story caught her attention, a video from earlier that week. Karen stood in the very same diner Sophie worked in, camera angled just right to flatter her surgically enhanced jawline. She complained about her waitress. No names, but Sophie's worn sneakers and stained apron were visible in the background. The caption read, "The service industry is dying. Standards, gone." Sophie's hands curled into fists. The next video was worse. Karen panned over her luxury SUV, pausing dramatically on a scratch that looked remarkably similar to one already on her car. "This is what happens when you park next to trash," she said, voice syrupy with faux concern. "They get jealous. They lash out. Luckily, I'm documenting everything for legal. No proof. Just accusation and worse, likes." It wasn't just her reputation Karen was playing with. It was her job, her son's future. All for content, Sophie closed the laptop and stared into the quiet. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was focused. If Karen wanted to live online, then that's where the battle would be. The next day, Sophie walked into the diner 30 minutes early and approached Jay, the line cook and unofficial tech wizard. Jay was young, sharp, and just cynical enough to appreciate a bit of digital drama. "Hey," she said, her voice low. "You ever mess around with video editing?" He glanced up from his phone. Define mess around. Sophie hesitated, then pulled out her phone and showed him the clip Karen had posted. Jay watched it, smirking. "She's a piece of work. I need help," she said. "And I need to stay anonymous." Jay leaned in. "What's the play?" "Expose her, but it's gotta be smart. Real smart." Over the next few nights, Sophie gathered footage. Nothing illegal. Just public content. Karen's own words, her tone-deaf rants, the moments where the mask slipped. Every snide comment disguised as truth-telling, every time she mocked staff, lied for attention, or manipulated a situation for sympathy. Jay stitched it all together into a short, sharp montage, overlaid with text that gave just enough context to raise eyebrows, but not enough to trace back to Sophie. At the end of the video, a question lingered in bold white letters. Is this who we follow? They posted it to a burner account on TikTok. No hashtags, no tags. Just a caption. She thought no one was watching. Within 12 hours, it had 20,000 views. By the next day, it crossed $100,000. Comments flooded in. Some recognized Karen instantly, others debated whether the video was real. Screenshots of her posts started circulating on Reddit threads dedicated to influencer fails. People combed through her feed, pulling receipts. One user identified a fake giveaway she never fulfilled. Another claimed to be a former assistant she'd refused to pay. Karen, oblivious to the growing wildfire, continued posting as usual. Morning matcha, motivational quotes, her usual blend of self-worship and subtle cruelty. But the tone of the comments shifted. You really treat service workers like that? Is this the lady from the TikTok? Wow, your realness is actually just narcissism. Within a week, her follower count began to drop. Not drastically, but enough to notice. Enough to sting. And Sophie? She didn't gloat. She watched. Went to work, picked up Leo from daycare, kept her head down, but something in her had changed. A quiet confidence. The knowledge that she wasn't powerless after all. Until one night, as she wiped down a counter near closing, Karen stormed into the diner. This time, she wasn't wearing sunglasses. Her hair was frizzy, her eyes red, and her posture unsteady. She looked less like a queen and more like someone watching her kingdom crumble. She marched up to Sophie. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, low enough that the manager at the back couldn't hear. Sophie blinked. "Excuse me? You're behind that video." "I know it's you." Sophie stared back, voice calm. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Karen leaned in. "You're a sad little waitress with a martyr complex. You think the internet's going to save you? Please, I have lawyers." Sophie shrugged. "Then you should probably call them." Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her face twisted with frustration, but the fire was fading. She turned to leave, but paused, tossing one last glare over her shoulder. This isn't over, but they both knew it was. Because for the first time, the crowd wasn't clapping, and behind the curtain, someone was finally pulling the strings. The storm broke on a Thursday. Karen's face, once glowing in selfies and softly filtered morning videos, now flashed across social media for all the wrong reasons. Screenshots of her cruel comments, clips of her berating baristas, even audio of her mocking a disabled customer, each piece snapped into place like a puzzle that no longer painted perfection, but exposed rot beneath the gloss. News outlets picked it up. At first, just internet gossip columns. But then a regional segment aired, "When Influencers Go Too Far, the Cost of Cruelty in the Age of Virality." Karen had always wanted to be famous. Now, she was. Sophie watched the segment from the break room, phone in hand, heart hammering in her chest. Not from fear, from awe. The story never mentioned her, never traced back the digital trail. Jay had helped cover every track, every metadata slip. She was invisible, exactly how Karen had once treated her. But this time, invisibility was power. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. Sophie saw it firsthand 3 days later. The diner was quiet during the mid-afternoon lull. A light drizzle coated the windows, blurring the street beyond into soft gray shapes. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. Karen entered alone. Gone were the heels, the designer purse, the armor of polished confidence. Her sweatpants sagged, her hoodie swallowed her frame. She looked like someone who had barely slept, haunted, hollowed out. Her eyes flicked around the room, searching. And then she saw Sophie. For a moment, neither moved. Then Karen walked up, to the counter, dragging her feet like they were shackled. "Hi," she muttered. Sophie didn't flinch. "Hello?" Karen opened her mouth, hesitated, then exhaled. "Can we talk?" Sophie gestured toward an empty booth. "Go ahead." Karen sat, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in her voice. "I lost 3 brand deals this week," she said, staring at her hands. "One of them was 6 figures. My PR team quit. People I've worked with for years won't return my calls. Sophie said nothing. I know it was you, Karen whispered. Can you prove it? Karen looked up, startled. Sophie's gaze was steady. Because if you can't, you should be careful what you say next. Karen's lip trembled. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just trying to build a brand. Everyone exaggerates. Everyone plays a character. Sophie leaned forward. You keyed my car. You humiliated me in front of my son. You tried to get me fired. That's not a character. That's who you are. Karen blinked quickly, struggling to hold her tears. I didn't think people would care, she murmured. I thought they'd forget in a day, that I could post an apology and move on. And did you? Karen shook her head. Sophie let the silence stretch between them. Why are you really here? She finally asked. Karen looked up, desperation leaking into every syllable. To apologize, to ask you to take it down, the video, the posts, whatever. You've done. Please. Sophie tilted her head. You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught. Karen opened her mouth, closed it, and said nothing. Behind the counter, Jay watched, arms crossed. He didn't speak, but Sophie could feel his support like a wall behind her. I can't fix what's happened to you, Sophie said, rising to her feet. But maybe now you'll think twice before stepping on people just because you can. Karen stared down at the table. So that's it? No. Sophie's voice was clear, unwavering. That's justice. Karen didn't respond. She just sat there, lost in the wreckage of her own creation. Later that week, the final blow landed. Someone unearthed an old clip, one where Karen mocked a charity campaign she had supported. The story blew up, sponsorships dried up. Her YouTube channel hemorrhaged subscribers. A legal investigation opened into her fake giveaways. The same followers who once worshipped her turned with viper-like precision, dissecting every lie, every crack in her facade. By Sunday, Karen posted a tearful video. No makeup, no lighting, just raw. It was supposed to be a heartfelt apology. Instead, the comment section tore her apart. Sophie didn't watch it. She was too busy helping Leo build a Lego spaceship on the living room floor. Her phone buzzed. A message from Jay. She's going dark. Deleted Twitter, locked her IG. We won. She stared at it. A strange mix of satisfaction and calm washing over her. Not joy, not triumph. Just closure. Leo held up the crooked spaceship proudly. Look, Mommy, it's strong, she smiled. Yeah, baby, it really is. As the sun dipped behind the clouds and light poured softly through the windows, Sophie felt something she hadn't felt in months. Peace. And maybe, just maybe, a little pride. Because sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't mean shouting the loudest or throwing the hardest punch. Sometimes it means waiting, watching, knowing exactly where to strike. And when justice finally comes, it lands like thunder. Clean, unmistakable, and echoing forever.